My wife suddenly left me to find herself. I am heartbroken and very disturbed by her behavior. My wife, 28, and I, 31, married 3 years ago and recently decided to get divorced after being separated for 2 months. I was totally blindsided when my wife initiated the separation out of nowhere. Even though I'm second-guessing everything now, I truly felt that we had had an exceptionally loving and fulfilling marriage up to that point despite my wife's mental health issues, bipolar/depression, and CPTSD surfacing at times. Initially, I thought the separation could be a good thing for her in addressing many of her fears about marriage. Unfortunately, it quickly became clear that something much more serious was going on with her, and I started taking action to get help for both her and our marriage. She had been in a deep depression for several months before the separation, and her medication seemed to stop working. I think she got to a point where she just started making really big changes in her life in an attempt to feel alive again. I felt like we were making progress until another guy came into the picture and suddenly swept her off her feet. This set off major alarm bells for me, but things got to the point where I realized that I needed to jump ship for my own good. It's only been a few weeks since we both agreed a divorce was the best way forward, but I'm now trying to make sense of what just happened. I am personally in a good place and know that I'll be okay going forward, but I'm also worried that she is riding a manic wave that's soon going to come crashing down. I'm worried she could potentially turn things against herself in a dangerous way once reality sets in. I wouldn't be so hesitant to cut her out of my life if this behavior wasn't so wildly uncharacteristic of her. I'm trying to nudge her into seeing a therapist, but I don't know what else I should or shouldn't be doing. The long version. My wife had a profoundly tragic childhood and is still suffering from its effects. Her parents created a toxic environment in which they bullied, gaslight, and mocked their children as a way to feed their own egos. She was sexually abused by a relative at a young age, even though she has no active memories of it, and was exposed to the toxic sexuality of her parents who used sex and infidelity as a way to control each other. She eventually ran away to live with deeply religious family members where she saw many examples of other unhealthy marriages with strict gender roles where women were expected to be somewhat subordinate to their husband's authority. She has made a lot of progress over the years in dealing with aspects of this complex and layered trauma, but she still has a lot of work ahead of her to fully heal from it. She has a poor memory, struggles to know what she really wants for herself, and has crippling anxiety about how she is perceived by others, just to name a few of the lasting impacts. Our marriage seemed really good up until recently. Many people have told us about how they have looked up to us as an example couple in many ways. However, my wife has always had fears about marriage, even though she was the one who really pushed for us to get married. The first fear has been that she is going to lose her identity or autonomy in marriage and become subservient to me. This makes total sense given her upbringing, but I grew up in a home where we had no reason to think our parents were anything but equals. The other fear was that a certain passionate chemistry was missing from our relationship. She had been in a very intense relationship previously with extreme emotional high and low points that left her paradoxically hating and longing for the guy afterwards. They were both in a band together and she felt like they both spoke some sort of deep shared emotional language, but he also didn't treat her well and had started living a certain lifestyle that she was very uncomfortable with. When I came into her life, she loved that I was the opposite of him in that I was nice to her and had my life more figured out. She did have fears because we had different tastes in things like music, art, and academic interests. At the time, both our therapist and I pointed out that it was okay to not have everything in common and that some of the things we had in common were the important things like emotional chemistry, good communication, and shared values. She came to agree with this, but her fears periodically came up every once in a while. A few months after we got married, we moved to another state for my job and had a really good first year and a half. However, something changed about a year ago. Around this time, a few things happened. She was diagnosed with bipolar and put on some new medication that initially seemed to work really well and then suddenly didn't anymore. She also stopped taking birth control, which she had taken for many years to regulate a hormonal issue. Her mental health issues seemed to get better for a little bit, but when her sister got divorced, she fell into a deep depression that she was in off and on until recently. During this depression, nothing seemed to change on an emotional level between us, but but our sex life completely dried up. Sex had always been difficult for her because of her associations with abuse and fears of becoming her parents. I have always tried to be as accommodating and understanding as possible about sex, but she would express fears that I was going to get bored with her and leave her because she never felt in the mood. At one point she started to question if she was asexual, but it seemed clear to me that she did feel sexual feelings, but they would quickly dissipate due to trauma responses. Alarmingly, she once told me that she felt like it would be easier to have sex with a stranger than sex with a husband because there wouldn't be any strings attached or need for emotional vulnerability. Around Christmas, her sisters introduced her to marijuana and shrooms with the intention of helping her deal with repressed feelings and memories of trauma. Her experiences were really helpful for the most part, as they seemed to allow her to turn off self-critical thought patterns. In fact, a couple of experiences seemed quite reaffirming to our marriage, as she would feel like she could see our relationship more objectively. Before the pandemic hit, she was really struggling as a student teacher because being observed and critiqued brought up some really deep issues from her past. Once the lockdown started, she was initially relieved to not be doing student teaching anymore, but her depression started to set in more intensely. We decided that it would be helpful for her mental health to send her back to our home state to stay with family for a few weeks. This trip did wonders for her mood and outlook on life. When she came back home, however, she felt trapped and started to demand that we sell everything and move back to our home state. I pushed back, saying I couldn't abruptly quit my job and leave because it would leave my employer in a dire situation and would put us in a very bad financial situation. With the help of a counselor, we made a compromise and agreed that December would be a reasonable time for us to be able to make the move without creating chaos for ourselves and others. The next month was really great, as we were spending lots of time together outdoors and talking about what our futures could look like. One day, she took a weed gummy for anxiety and had some kind of experience in which she claimed to have realized that she had been repressing feelings about wanting to leave our marriage for a long time. This culminated in her saying that she was going to initiate a trial separation in which she would move back to her hometown and experiment with things she is worried about missing out on in her youth, i.e. partying and casual sex. She said she wanted to make things work with me, but in order to do that she would need some space outside of our marriage. My first attempt to talk her out of it was to explain that there was no way we could financially make that work unless she got a job, something that seemed unlikely at the time due to unemployment from the pandemic. She eventually said that she was just going to use surplus student loan money in the several thousands of dollars to pay for a new car and rent until she found a job there. This seemed like a terrible decision and was totally out of character because she had always been the one who was so worried about getting into debt. Ultimately, I came to accept the separation because I realized she was going to go regardless of what I thought about it. My pushback would just reaffirm her fears about being trapped in our marriage. I also started to see the potential upside to the situation, as it could help put a lot of her fears about our marriage to rest by seeing that I was willing to give her that space. I also didn't think much of her wanting to open up the marriage because she had started to think that she might be asexual, but I also realized that it could be important for her to feel like she at least had the option. She called a week after arriving in our home state to tell me that she had slept with a male friend. I was totally shocked that she'd actually gone through with it. At first, the experience was pretty awkward and somewhat affirming to her of our relationship because he didn't seem to show her the same level of care that I did. Ultimately, though, the experience ended up being quite traumatic for her because they had previously been good friends, but he pretty much ghosted her after it happened. A few days later, she called to say that she felt like she needed to permanently leave our marriage because of an epiphany about her life that she had after a tarot reading. I panicked because just the day before she had been saying lots of things that had led me to believe that she was recognizing lots of things about how good our marriage was. I flew out a few days later, stayed with my parents, and began going to marriage counseling with her. The therapist was really good, and I felt like she was able to get some important things through to my wife about not making impulsive decisions while so much of her mental health and CPTSD symptoms were not being treated. One painful bombshell that came up in our sessions was that she had come to the realization that she wasn't actually sexually attracted to me. In fact, she worried that she had never been attracted to me but hadn't been able to know that because she had been repressing her sexuality for most of her life. This didn't totally make sense to me based on my memories up until around our marriage. I did make an interesting observation though that her sex drive seemed to have really plummeted around the time she stopped taking birth control. I did some research and it turns out it's a thing for women to become less attracted to their partners when they stop taking birth control if they had been taking it before the relationship. Meanwhile, I got permission for a work transfer back to our home state, so we decided to go back to where we had been living and officially move all our stuff back with the expectation that we would figure out how to move forward once we got back. In the week before we flew back to move, we were having really good daily conversations and she was telling me things like how much spending time with other people was reaffirming her appreciation for me as a husband. Things felt good. Then a huge plot twist happened 2 days before the trip. She had taken a wee gummy with 2 friends, male and female, who she had been trying to set up with one another. However, the guy ended up confessing that he had been in love with my wife for years. She called me the night before our trip to tell me about this, and my first reaction was to feel really bad for her because she has had serious issues with him in the past. They have been in a band together for many years and his alcoholism always created serious problems for them. He has been sober for over a year at this point, but she had always been worried about him relapsing and his drunk side coming out. This is why I was blown away when she said that she thought she might actually have feelings for him too. She told me this had been preceded by an epiphany she had while high with him that she doesn't actually believe in monogamy because every person can bring something unique to a relationship. This put me in a terrible mood and raised my blood pressure, but I sort of talked myself down from it that night and the next morning. She was supposed to pick me up that afternoon at a certain time to leave on our trip, but it turned out she was an hour late because she had gone over to this guy's house for what was supposed to be a small chat about the situation before leaving town for a few weeks and ended up having sex with him. I'd never felt such awful emotions in my life. I was really hurt but also incredibly alarmed for so many reasons at the same time. It was the worst possible timing for this to happen because I really needed space from her, but we had to leave then or our moving plans would have gotten really screwed up. When we arrived back at the place we had lived for the past 2.5 years, she became very emotionally distant from me and started acting uncharacteristically energetic and vibrant. I recognized this as new relationship energy and realized that she was probably making such poor decisions because it was making her feel better than she had in a long time. She started talking to this guy on the phone in front of me and I flipped out and told her to go somewhere else if she was going to talk to him. She agreed and started leaving for several hours each day to talk to him. It was particularly painful to be feeling such intense isolation and distance from her in the home where we had shared so much love up until 2 months prior. It was also surreal to realize that this situation literally felt like one of the many nightmares she had had over the years where I would leave her and fall in love with someone else while she had to watch it all unfold. This behavior went against everything I thought I had known about the person I had spent the past 5 years of my life with. I recognize the following details are probably unnecessary, but there hasn't been any other context where it's been remotely appropriate to vent about them, so here they go. She had purchased a vibrator several weeks before the trip after a friend recommended it as a way to work through some of her sexual trauma. I was super supportive of this because she had never been able to come close to masturbating as it brought up a lot of trauma responses for her, and I recognized that this would be a great way to help her work through her sex issues. She had tried to use it before our trip, but she felt like she had to push herself to use it since she didn't find it very enjoyable. After messing around with that guy, she ended up bringing it on the trip and all of a sudden started going through a masturbation renaissance. I felt insane because I had been rooting for her to be able to get to that place for years, but the fact that this tryst with the new guy was the thing that helped her make this breakthrough made me feel physically ill. As we sold and packed up our things to move, I started reflecting on many negative aspects of our marriage that hadn't really been in the foreground until then. As I reflected more, I found peace in realizing that my life could be so much better without her. When she told me that things with this guy were progressing really quickly and that she was pretty far gone from trying to make the marriage work, I told her that I also felt like bringing the marriage to an end was the right thing to do. In hindsight, I worry that me agreeing to a divorce so quickly was too impulsive, but I also feel like her behavior set off so many red flags and made me realize that she is much sicker than I thought. I have started to worry a lot about the future though. I'm in a good place and will be fine going forward. but she seems to obviously be riding a manic wave of some sort, and I'm worried it's all going to come crashing down, in which case she might end up in a very dangerous situation. I have limited my contact with her, but she told me recently that she's been having nightmares about me cheating on her, which she seems to fully realize is totally unfair and illogical given the circumstances. I am currently trying to push her towards seeing a therapist ASAP, but I'm dumbfounded and confused about what I should be doing in this situation. I wouldn't be so hesitant to cut her out of my life if this behavior wasn't so wildly uncharacteristic of her. One thing that I have thought of is that she could have been lying and trying to get with this guy the whole time, in which case I would have no qualms cutting her out of my life and never speaking to her again. I don't think it's impossible, but it doesn't make sense given the fact that she is the most transparent person I've ever known, to the degree that it has created serious problems for her in the past. Then again, it could all be a trick to make her seem exceptionally honest. I don't know what to think about anything anymore.